November 1st, 1800. A cold rain falls on a half-finished mansion rising from the mud of a malarial swamp. President John Adams climbs wooden stairs past workmen still laying stone, past rooms without plaster, past windows that let in the November chill. He enters what will become the most famous residence in America, a house built by enslaved hands, burned by enemies, expanded by ambition, and haunted by the contradictions of a nation that declared all men equal while binding them in chains. Today, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue receives over 1 million visitors annually. Its 132 rooms span 55,000 square feet. But how many of those visitors know that the gleaming white exterior, the very feature that gave this building its name, is itself a cover-up, painted over burn marks from a foreign invasion? How many understand that the grand state dining room, where presidents host world leaders, sits atop tunnels dug by enslaved workers who would never be invited to dinner? This is not the sanitized story of American democracy's most iconic building. This is the dark truth behind the symbol. Chapter 1. The house that should never have been stand at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue today. And you see power. Wrought iron fencing, armed guards, the perfect symmetry of white columns against manicured lawns. But rewind to 1791, and you'd be standing in wilderness. President George Washington never lived in the White House. He commissioned it, planned it, watched over its construction with obsessive detail, but died before its completion. This fact alone should tell you something. The house was always more important than any single occupant. It was a statement building, designed to prove that this upstart collection of colonies could create something permanent, something that rivaled the palaces of Europe. The location was a compromise born of political horse trading. Northern states wanted the capital in New York or Philadelphia. Southern states refused to accept permanent Northern dominance. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton struck their famous dinner deal in June 1790. The South would support Hamilton's financial plan, and the North would accept a capital on the Potomac River, conveniently located between Maryland and Virginia. Slave states, both. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the French engineer who designed the capital city, envisioned a president's palace 5 times larger than what was eventually built. His ego and his ambitions exceeded his authority. Washington fired him in 1792, before construction even began. Irish architect James Hoban won the commission with a design based on Leinster House in Dublin. Ironic, given that this house of democracy was modeled on an aristocratic Georgian mansion. The cornerstone was laid October 13, 1792. The projected cost, $390,000. The actual cost would exceed $400,000, equivalent to roughly $14 million today. But these numbers tell only part of the story. They don't account for the cost paid in human flesh. The mansion required over 3 million bricks, sandstone blocks from Virginia quarries, each weighing several hundred pounds, timber from forests cleared by hand. Someone had to dig the foundations in the clay soil. Someone had to haul those stones. Someone had to lay those bricks in summer heat and winter cold. That someone was enslaved. The records are deliberately vague. Slave labor was already controversial in 1792, and the government commissioners overseeing construction kept their accounting intentionally opaque. But we know that enslaved workers were rented from their owners at $5 per month. We know that the government paid slaveholders for this labor, not the workers themselves. We know that skilled enslaved carpenters, stonemasons, and blacksmiths performed work requiring years of training, yet received nothing but basic food and shelter. The commissioners' records mention Negro hire as casually as they mention nails and lumber. A June 1795 entry notes payment to a Mr. Middleton for hire of 2 Negroes for 6 months. Another records payment to Daniel Carroll for Negro hire. These weren't names, They were line items. White workers, many of them Scottish stonemasons and Irish laborers, worked alongside the enslaved, creating a complex social hierarchy at the construction site. The white workers received wages. The enslaved received nothing. Both built the same house, but the myth that would later develop would emphasize the skilled European craftsmen and erase the black workers entirely. By 1800, the house was barely habitable. Abigail Adams, the second First Lady, famously hung her laundry to dry in the unfinished East Room. She wrote to her daughter describing the house as built for ages to come, but complained that not a single room was fully complete. Workmen tracked mud through unfinished halls. The main stairs remained unfinished. The grounds were a morass of construction debris. John Adams lived in the house for only 4 months. His successor, Thomas Jefferson, a man who understood architecture, owned slaves, and performed mental gymnastics to reconcile his ideals with his actions, would be the first to truly inhabit the mansion. Jefferson would also be the first to reshape it, adding colonnades to hide the service areas where enslaved staff worked. From the beginning, the White House embodied American contradiction. Built by unfree labor for free men. Funded by a republic that was also an empire of slavery. Designed to showcase democratic ideals while physically segregating those who served from those who governed. The house's very foundations rest on this paradox. Dig deep enough beneath the north lawn, and you'll find the clay that enslaved hands scooped. The bricks in the original walls were formed in molds held by men who would never be considered citizens. The mortar was mixed by workers whose names we will never know. This is where our story truly begins, not with presidents and politicians, but with the hidden labor force that made their power possible. Chapter 2. The Architect of Oppression. James Hoban arrived in America from Ireland in 1785, another immigrant seeking opportunity in the new republic. By 1792, at age 33, he had won the most prestigious architectural commission in the nation. His design for the President's House would define American governmental architecture for centuries. But Hoban's legacy is inseparable from the system that made his vision possible. Hoban wasn't just an architect, he was a slave owner. In the 1790s, Hoban purchased several enslaved workers to supplement the labor force building the White House. He rented others from nearby plantations. His personal account books, preserved in the National Archives, reveal purchases of Negro cloth for workers' clothing and payments to slave catchers when workers escaped. This wasn't unusual for the time. It was standard practice. That's what makes it so damning. The architect of America's most symbolic building owned human beings. Let that settle for a moment. Hoban received 8 acres of land and $500 as his prize for winning the design competition. Over the next 8 years, he would be paid a total of $2,500 for overseeing construction. Substantial money for the era. The enslaved workers who turned his drawings into reality received nothing. They weren't even mentioned in the official commemorations. The construction site operated from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. Workers mixed mortar, carved stone, laid brick, hauled timber. In summer, temperatures in the tidal Potomac Basin regularly exceeded 90 degrees with oppressive humidity. In winter, workers labored in freezing rain. Enslaved workers had no choice but to continue. White laborers could quit, though economic desperation often bound them nearly as tightly. The sandstone used for the original exterior came from quarries in Aquia, Virginia, 40 miles south. Enslaved quarrymen cut the stone blocks using hand tools. Each block weighed between 400 and 600 pounds. They were loaded onto boats, floated up the Potomac, then hauled by cart to the construction site. At every stage, enslaved labor powered the process. Inside the mansion, the division between public and private space was carefully designed. The state floor, where presidents would receive dignitaries, featured soaring ceilings, ornate plasterwork, and expansive windows. Below this, partially underground, was the ground floor, kitchens, storage, and workspaces. This is where enslaved staff would spend their days, invisible to visitors above. Hoban designed service stairs, narrow, steep, hidden behind walls, so that enslaved servants could move through the house without being seen by guests. This architectural segregation would define the White House for over a century. The powerful would live in light and space. The servants would live in darkness and confinement. The physical structure embedded social hierarchy into every dimension. Room heights decreased as you descended floors. Windows grew smaller. Corridors narrowed. The architecture itself declared, "Some humans matter more than others." Thomas Jefferson, who moved into the house in 1801, brought his own enslaved staff from Monticello. He employed about a dozen enslaved workers at the White House, including James Hemings' brother, Peter Hemings, and several members of the enslaved Hemings family. They cooked his meals, cleaned his rooms, maintained his wardrobe, and managed the household while Jefferson wrote letters about liberty and natural rights. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. Jefferson expanded the house, adding terraces and wings. He brought in French cuisine and expensive wines. He hosted elaborate dinners where he discussed philosophy and democracy. And all of it, every refined conversation, every intellectual debate about human freedom, was served by people he owned. The early White House was a relatively modest operation by European palace standards. During Jefferson's presidency, the household staff numbered around 15, including both enslaved and free servants. But this created an intimate horror. The enslaved workers knew their masters personally. They heard the conversations about liberty. They served at tables where men debated the meaning of equality. And then they returned to their quarters, still enslaved. Some of these workers have names we know. Paul Jennings, enslaved by James Madison, worked at the White House and later wrote the first memoir by a White House staff member. His account, published in 1865, provides invaluable insight into the daily operations of the early mansion. But for every Paul Jennings whose story survived, dozens of others remain nameless. The wages paid to free White House servants in the early 19th century ranged from $8 to $12 per month. Skilled positions, the steward, the chief cook, might earn $15. Meanwhile, the government paid slaveholders $5 to $8 monthly to rent enslaved workers. The slaveholder pocketed the money. The worker received nothing beyond minimal food and shelter. This economic calculation drove the labor system. Why pay full wages when you could rent a slave for less and bear none of the long-term costs? The White House, like the nation itself, was built on this brutal arithmetic. Hoban remained involved with the White House for decades, supervising repairs and renovations. When the British burned the mansion in 1814, Hoban oversaw the reconstruction. He died in 1831, a respected citizen of Washington, buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery. His architectural legacy remains visible in every photograph of the White House. His moral legacy, the system of exploitation he participated in and profited from, is less visible but equally permanent. Chapter 3. Building the Symbol, Breaking the Bodies. The construction of the White House required 120 workers at peak employment. At any given time, about half were enslaved. This wasn't a footnote to history. This was the workforce. The workday began at dawn. In summer, that meant 5 in the morning. Workers gathered at the construction site on what would become the North Lawn, received their assignments, and began labor that wouldn't end until sunset, often 12 to 14 hours later. There were no safety regulations, no injury compensation, no retirement plans. There was only work. The specific tasks reveal the breadth of skill required. Enslaved workers included stonemasons who cut and shaped sandstone blocks with hand tools, creating the precise angles needed for the mansion's classical design. This required years of training and immense physical strength. The stone dust filled their lungs with every hammer strike. Carpenters who framed the interior, crafted window sashes, built the elaborate staircase, and created the detailed woodwork that would later be painted and gilded. These men understood geometry, load-bearing structures, and fine joinery. Their skills were as sophisticated as any European craftsman's. Bricklayers who created the interior walls, the chimneys, and the kitchen structures. Laying 3 million bricks by hand, one at a time, maintaining level and plumb without modern tools. The repetitive motion destroyed shoulders and backs. Laborers who dug foundations, mixed mortar, hauled materials, and cleared the site. This was the most physically punishing work. Moving earth and stone without machinery, using only shovels, carts, and human muscle. The commissioner's records from 1794 through 1800 document payments for Negro hire totaling over $5,000, roughly $170,000 in today's money. But this money didn't go to the workers. It went to the slaveholders who rented out their human property. Slaveholders received regular income without any investment of their own labor. The system enriched them while extracting maximum value from enslaved bodies. Working conditions were brutal even by contemporary standards. The construction site had no running water. Workers drank from barrels filled from nearby springs. Sanitation was primitive, likely just trenches dug at the site's edge. In the humid Washington summers, disease spread easily. Contemporary accounts mention agues and fevers, likely malaria from the mosquitoes breeding in the marshy Potomac bottomland. Injuries were common and often severe. A fall from scaffolding could mean death or permanent disability. A misswing of a hammer could shatter fingers. Heavy stones dropped on feet, crushing bones. There was no workman's compensation, no medical care beyond basic first aid. An injured enslaved worker represented a temporary loss to the slaveholder, who might seek compensation from the commissioners. The worker's suffering was irrelevant to the accounting. We know of at least one death during construction. Records mention a worker named David killed by a cart. No other details survive. Was David enslaved or free? Black or white? How old was he? Did he have a family? The records don't say. He became another line item. Expenses related to his burial, noted and forgotten. The technical challenges of the construction were substantial. The site's clay soil required deep foundations to prevent settling. Workers dug by hand. No powered equipment, no shortcuts. Just shovels, sweat, and endless loads of dirt hauled away in wheelbarrows. The exterior walls required precision stone cutting. Each block had to be shaped to exact specifications, creating smooth joints and maintaining level courses. Enslaved stonemasons worked alongside Scottish craftsmen, performing identical tasks. But when the day ended, the Scottish workers returned to rented rooms with money in their pockets. The enslaved workers returned to their quarters with nothing. The original roof structure used massive timber beams, some 40 feet long, cut from forests and hauled to the site by cart. Raising these beams into place required coordinated effort by dozens of workers using rope and pulley systems. One mistake, one broken rope, and the beam could crush the workers below. Every major structural element represented a potential catastrophe. Interior plasterwork required different skills. Plasterers mixed lime, sand, and water to create smooth walls and ornate ceiling decorations. The lime was caustic. It burned skin on contact and created toxic dust when dry. Plasterers worked with hands and clothes constantly wet with corrosive material. Over time, the lime destroyed their skin and nails. The kitchens, located in the ground floor, required extensive brickwork for ovens and fireplaces. These cooking facilities would need to serve formal state dinners for dozens of guests. Enslaved workers built these kitchens knowing they would later work in them, preparing meals they would never taste, serving guests who would never acknowledge their existence. By 1800, the basic structure was complete, but the interior remained unfinished. This partial completion forced workers to labor in dangerous conditions, working on upper floors while lower levels were still under construction, navigating unfinished staircases, moving through spaces without proper lighting or ventilation. The total construction cost exceeded $400,000, but this figure obscures the real cost. Thousands of hours of uncompensated labor extracted through violence and coercion, creating wealth for everyone except the workers who built the house. The commissioners saved money by using enslaved labor instead of free workers. The government benefited from this cost savings. The nation got its Capitol building at a discount. The enslaved paid the difference with their bodies. James Hoban's account books show payments for Negro clothing, rough fabric to make work clothes. The clothing was cheap because enslaved workers didn't need to look presentable. They needed to work. A single set of clothes per year was standard. When the clothes wore out, as they quickly did, workers patched them until patches covered patches. This was the uniform of the men who built the most powerful residence in the nation. Some workers escaped. Running away from a construction site offered advantages: confusion, temporary anonymity, the possibility of blending into the growing free black population of Washington and Georgetown. Newspaper ads from the period advertised rewards for captured runaways, some describing men who worked on the president's house. These ads reveal fragments of personality: a man with a distinctive scar, another who could read, a third known for his carpentry skills. Each was hunted, each was property to be recovered. The White House rose slowly, its white sandstone walls emerging from the mud like a classical temple. But temples require sacrifice. This one was built on the sacrifice of people who had no choice but to build it. Chapter 4. The Gilded Cage. November 1st, 1800. President John Adams finally moves into the unfinished mansion. That night, he writes to his wife, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." These words would later be carved in the state dining room mantelpiece. They contain no mention of the enslaved people serving him as he writes. The early White House was simultaneously a symbol of Republican simplicity and a site of elaborate social performance. European diplomats, accustomed to genuine palaces, found it modest. American citizens saw it as almost too grand. But everyone who visited encountered the same fundamental structure: a public face of democratic power supported by invisible labor. The state floor became the stage for America's political theater. The East Room, largest in the house at over 4,800 square feet, hosted formal receptions. The Blue Room served as the primary receiving room, its elliptical shape designed to facilitate the flow of guests in a circular pattern. Democratic rotation instead of courtly hierarchy. The state dining room could accommodate 40 guests, though it would later be expanded. But every state dinner, every diplomatic reception, every political gathering required extensive behind-the-scenes labor. This labor happened out of sight, in the ground floor and basement spaces. The kitchen occupied the northwest corner of the ground floor. It contained 3 large fireplaces for cooking, brick ovens for baking, and a massive table for food preparation. In the early 19th century, cooking for 40 people meant managing multiple fires simultaneously, coordinating timing across dishes, and maintaining exact temperatures without thermometers. This required extraordinary skill. The kitchen staff, predominantly enslaved, worked 16-hour days when the president entertained. They rose before dawn to light fires and begin preparation. They worked through the dinner service, then spent hours cleaning afterward. They might finish at midnight or later. The next morning, they began again. Enslaved cooks occupied a peculiar position in the White House hierarchy. Their skills were essential. A president's reputation depended partly on the quality of his table. Yet they remained property. They created culinary art while being denied freedom. The contradiction was absolute. Beyond the kitchen, the ground floor contained the steward's room, storage areas, and servant quarters. Some enslaved staff lived in these cramped spaces. Others lived nearby in slave quarters behind the mansion. The proximity to power didn't translate to power. They inhabited the heart of American government while being excluded from governance. Daily operations required constant labor. Water had to be hauled from nearby wells. The White House wouldn't have running water until 1833. Chamber pots required emptying. Fireplaces needed cleaning and relighting. Lamps needed filling with whale oil. Floors required sweeping. The endless maintenance of a large house, all performed by hand, all performed by people who could be bought and sold. The housekeeping staff followed a rigid schedule. Mornings began with cleaning fireplaces and laying new fires. Public rooms had to be pristine before the president rose. Private quarters were cleaned while the family took breakfast. Afternoons focused on laundry, mending, and preparation for evening activities. The work never ended because a house this size deteriorated daily from use. James Madison's presidency, 1809 to 1817, marked the White House's first full occupancy. Madison brought at least a dozen enslaved workers from his Virginia plantation, Montpelier. His wife Dolly became famous for her elaborate social events, Wednesday evening drawing rooms where hundreds of guests gathered. These events required extensive preparation, furniture arrangement, food preparation, service coordination, and later, cleanup. Enslaved staff made Dolly's social success possible. One of these enslaved workers, Paul Jennings, left the only 19th-century memoir by a Black White House staff member. He described the daily routine, the relationships between staff and the presidential family, and the peculiar intimacy of enslaved domestic service. Jennings was 15 when he arrived at the White House. He served James Madison for decades. He was loyal, competent, and trusted. He remained enslaved. The annual operating cost of the early White House ran between $16,000 and $20,000, roughly $500,000 in today's money. This covered food, fuel, supplies, and wages for free servants. It didn't include compensation for enslaved workers because enslaved workers weren't compensated. The absence of these costs in the ledger made the White House more affordable to operate. Slavery was cost-effective governance. Presidential families paid some household expenses from their own funds, but Congress provided an annual appropriation for official entertaining. The line between official and personal spending was blurry. Presidents sometimes paid enslaved workers small tips or holiday gifts, a few dollars annually. These token payments salved consciences but didn't change the fundamental relationship. A $5 Christmas gift to someone you owned wasn't generosity. It was performance. The social calendar followed seasonal patterns. Winter was the busiest. Congress was in session, diplomats were present, and weather made travel difficult, concentrating the political class in Washington. Enslaved staff worked hardest when the city was most active. Summer brought relative quiet. The president often left Washington's oppressive heat and malaria risk. Some enslaved staff accompanied him. Others remained to maintain the empty house. The White House became America's most visible address. Yet most Americans never saw it. In the early 19th century, the mansion was relatively accessible. Citizens could request tours, and New Year's Day featured public receptions where thousands attended. But these events showcased the public rooms. Visitors never saw the kitchen, the servant quarters, the spaces where the real work happened. The mansion's grandeur depended on this invisibility. The marble floors gleamed because someone scrubbed them. The chandeliers sparkled because someone cleaned them. The formal gardens bloomed because someone tended them. But the someone remained nameless, faceless, erased from the story of American power. This was the White House at its peak of early Republican simplicity, a house where democratic ideals and slavery coexisted, where the symbol of freedom rested on foundations of bondage, where every state dinner celebrating liberty was served by people who had none. Chapter 5. The Reckoning That Never Came. On the night of August 24, 1814, British soldiers set fire to the White House. The flames consumed everything burnable: furniture, books, presidential papers, the interior woodwork that enslaved carpenters had crafted 20 years earlier. The sandstone walls survived, blackened by smoke. The interior was destroyed. This act of war, retaliation for American burning of Canadian government buildings, revealed something crucial. The White House was valuable enough to destroy. It had become a symbol worth attacking. But in the Reconstruction, America missed its opportunity for moral reckoning. The fire forced a complete interior rebuilding. James Hoban, now 64 years old, supervised the Reconstruction. He used the same labor model, a mix of free white craftsmen and enslaved black workers. The second construction repeated the sins of the first. Nobody questioned this. Nobody suggested paying all workers fair wages. The system that built the White House initially was re-employed to rebuild it. The reconstruction cost $450,000, exceeding even the original construction budget. Insurance didn't exist for government buildings. Congress had to appropriate the funds, leading to debates about whether to relocate the Capitol. Some Northern congressmen saw an opportunity to move the government away from the South. Southern legislators fought to keep it on the Potomac. The South won, again. Work began in 1815 and continued until 1817. The burned walls were cleaned and repaired, but the smoke stains proved impossible to remove completely. The solution? Paint the sandstone white. This practical decision to cover burn damage gave the building its enduring nickname. The White House is white because it's wearing camouflage, hiding scars from foreign invasion beneath a coat of paint. The enslaved workers who rebuilt the mansion remain even more anonymous than those who built it originally. The reconstruction happened faster, just 2 years compared to 8 for the original construction. This speed required longer hours, more intense labor. Workers raced to complete the project before James Monroe's inauguration in 1817. During this period, the question of slavery in Washington became increasingly contentious. The District of Columbia permitted slavery, but a growing abolitionist movement was making the practice politically uncomfortable. The capital of a free nation contained slave markets, slave jails, and slave catchers. Foreign visitors noted the hypocrisy. Domestic critics grew louder. Yet the White House continued to rely on enslaved labor. John Quincy Adams, 1825-1829, brought enslaved workers from his wife's family's plantation. Andrew Jackson, 1829-1837, brought at least a dozen enslaved people from Tennessee. These weren't temporary arrangements. Enslaved workers lived at the White House for years, sometimes decades, integral to its operations yet excluded from its purpose. The 1830s brought technological changes. Running water arrived in 1833. Iron pipes connected to nearby springs. This eliminated the daily hauling of water, but required new maintenance. The pipes froze in winter, leaked at joints, and needed constant repair. Central heating came in the 1840s. A coal-fired furnace in the basement provided heat through ducts. These improvements didn't reduce the need for labor. They just changed the work. The White House never had large slave quarters like a plantation. Enslaved staff lived in cramped rooms in the basement or in small outbuildings. They shared space. Privacy was impossible. Personal possessions were minimal. The contrast between their living conditions and the staterooms above was stark. 20 feet vertically separated the president's bedroom from the servants' quarters. It might as well have been a continental divide. Throughout this period, enslaved White House workers existed in a peculiar legal limbo. Washington, D.C. had courts, police, and laws, but enslaved people had no legal standing. They couldn't testify in court except against other black people. They couldn't leave the district without passes. They couldn't own property. They lived in the center of American government while being excluded from American law. Some enslaved White House workers purchased their freedom. Paul Jennings, after decades of service, bought himself for $200, roughly $7,000 in today's money. Think about that. He paid for the right to own himself. He worked for years, saving small tips and gifts, accumulating enough money to purchase what should never have been for sale. The physical expansion of the White House in the early 19th century added more space, but maintained the same hierarchical design. The West Wing addition in 1845 created more office space. The East Wing came later. But the ground floor remained the domain of servants, the state floor remained the domain of power, and enslaved workers remained invisible. No president before the Civil War questioned the fundamental system. Even those who personally opposed slavery, and several did, in theory, continued to use enslaved labor in their own household. The cognitive dissonance was complete. Men who spoke eloquently about freedom owned people. They signed documents declaring human equality while treating humans as property. The White House could have been different. Congress could have mandated that only free labor be used in the president's house. Presidents could have personally refused to bring enslaved workers to the Capitol. The decision to paint the Reconstruction white could have been accompanied by a decision to make the workforce truly free. None of this happened. By 1850, the White House had been standing for 50 years. 3 generations of enslaved workers had served within its walls. 3 generations had polished its floors, cooked its meals, maintained its grandeur. 3 generations had lived in the shadow of power without any power themselves. Their labor was essential. Their presence was constant. Their humanity was denied. The documents in the National Archives don't record their thoughts. We don't know what they felt, serving dinner to congressmen who debated fugitive slave laws. We don't know what they thought, cleaning rooms where presidents wrote speeches about American freedom. We can only imagine the bitter irony of their daily existence. What we do know is this. The White House embodied American hypocrisy in its most concentrated form. Every brick, every beam, every state dinner celebrated a nation that claimed to value freedom while profiting from slavery. The house was beautiful. The house was powerful. The house was built on moral failure so profound it would eventually tear the nation apart. The reckoning was coming. It would arrive in the form of a war that killed 600,000 people and burned half the country. But before that reckoning, the White House would host one more president who brought enslaved workers to Washington, James Buchanan, whose presidency, 1857 to 1861, would prove incapable of preventing the coming catastrophe. Chapter 6. The House Divided Against Itself. Abraham Lincoln arrived at the White House on March 4, 1861, inheriting a mansion and a nation both splitting apart. 7 states had already seceded. Within 6 weeks, Confederate artillery would fire on Fort Sumter. The White House, built by enslaved hands to symbolize unity, would become the command center for a war fought over slavery's future. Lincoln brought no enslaved workers to Washington. This wasn't merely symbolic. It was revolutionary. For the first time in the White House's 61-year history, a president refused to participate in the system that had built the house he now occupied. The break was clean and immediate. But enslaved people still worked at the White House when Lincoln arrived. They belonged to outgoing staff, to Washington residents who supplied services, to the complex web of slavery that entangled the Capitol. The Emancipation Proclamation wouldn't come until January 1863, and it wouldn't apply to the border states where many of these workers originated. The White House during the Civil War became something unprecedented, a military headquarters operating in a city constantly threatened by Confederate forces. The mansion sat just across the Potomac from enemy territory. Confederate flags flew in Virginia, visible from the White House windows. This proximity created constant tension and transformed the building's daily operations. Security arrived for the first time. Guards posted at gates. Sentries patrolled the grounds. Military officers came and went at all hours. The public access that had characterized the early White House disappeared. The war made the president a target, and the mansion became a fortress. Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady, employed both free black servants and white immigrants. Elizabeth Keckley, a formerly enslaved woman who purchased her freedom, became Mary's dressmaker and confidant. Keckley's memoir, published in 1868, provides intimate details of the Lincoln White House, the grief after their son Willie's death in 1862, the political pressures, the personal toll of war. The White House staff during the war years numbered around 30: cooks, maids, doorkeepers, messengers, and maintenance workers. They witnessed history from unique vantage points. They saw Lincoln exhausted after battlefield defeats. They heard the celebrations after victories. They watched the president age under the weight of 600,000 deaths. Lincoln used the White House to host formerly enslaved people, an act unthinkable to his predecessors. Frederick Douglass visited multiple times and later wrote about being received, just as you have seen one gentleman receive another. Sojourner Truth visited in 1864. These meetings weren't just symbolic. They represented a fundamental reimagining of who belonged in the People's House. The OIF, Compensated Emancipation Act, which Lincoln signed on April 16, 1862, freed enslaved people in Washington, D.C. The act paid slaveholders up to $300 per enslaved person, compensation for their property loss. The enslaved people themselves received nothing. Even in freedom, the system prioritized white economic interests. This created immediate change at the White House. Enslaved workers became employees overnight. They started receiving wages, small but real. The transformation wasn't seamless. Some former slaveholders continued to claim authority over workers they'd previously owned. The transition from property to person, from forced labor to paid employment, happened unevenly and with resistance. The White House's physical condition deteriorated during the war years. Maintenance deferred, repairs postponed. The mansion showed its age and its stress. Carpets wore thin. Paint peeled. The building reflected the nation, exhausted, damaged, barely holding together. Lincoln spent enormous time in the War Department telegraph office next door, waiting for news from battlefields. The White House became less a home and more a workspace. He held cabinet meetings in the upstairs study. He reviewed military strategy in the library. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation in what's now called the Lincoln bedroom, though he actually used it as an office. The contradiction of the White House reached its apex during the Civil War. A house built by enslaved labor became the headquarters for their liberation. The rooms where slaveholding presidents had lived now housed a president working to end slavery. The kitchen where enslaved cooks had worked now employed free workers. The transformation was incomplete, compromised, and deeply contested. But it was happening. White House staff during this period included William Slade, a free black man who served as steward and later as messenger to the president. Slade held Lincoln's confidence and managed household operations with authority rare for black workers in that era. After Lincoln's assassination, Slade would be one of the honor guards at the funeral. The war brought wounded soldiers to Washington by the thousands. Military hospitals filled the city. Mary Lincoln visited the wounded and brought them fruit and flowers. The White House, the symbol of federal authority, existed amid suffering on an unprecedented scale. The irony was inescapable. The house stood pristine while the nation bled. April 14, 1865. Good Friday. Robert E. Lee had surrendered 5 days earlier. The war was effectively over. That night, Lincoln attended Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning in a boarding house across from the theater. He never returned to the White House alive. His body lay in state in the East Room, the same room where Abigail Adams had hung laundry 65 years earlier, the same room that had hosted countless receptions and parties. Now it hosted a funeral for a martyred president. The House had seen tragedy before. Presidents had died in office, but never murder, never assassination. The Civil War should have been the White House's moral reckoning. The house built by enslaved labor had hosted the president who freed them. The circle should have closed with acknowledgement, with memorial, with truth-telling about the house's origins. It didn't happen. The official histories written after the war emphasized Lincoln's greatness, the Union's preservation, and the nation's reunion. They didn't emphasize the enslaved workers who built the house or the moral compromise embedded in its foundation. The opportunity for truth-telling passed. The narrative of American progress replaced the narrative of American guilt. Reconstruction would bring formal equality. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, guaranteed citizenship, and protected voting rights. But the White House itself never formally acknowledged its debt to enslaved labor. No memorial was erected. No names were recorded. The workers remained invisible, their contribution erased from the official story. The war ended. The house remained. And the silence about its origins deepened into deliberate forgetting. Chapter 7. Whitewashing History. The decades after the Civil War brought dramatic changes to the White House. Electric lights in 1891, extensive renovation in 1902, the West Wing expansion in 1909. The building modernized, expanded, and adapted to the 20th century. But one thing remained constant: the erasure of the enslaved workers who built it. The 1902 renovation, supervised by architect Charles McKim, gutted and rebuilt the interior. The project cost $475,000 and transformed the house into a modern presidential residence. McKim's vision emphasized classical grandeur and historical continuity. The renovation removed Victorian additions and restored what McKim imagined as the house's original character. But whose character? Whose vision? The renovation narrative emphasized James Hoban and the European craftsmen. It didn't mention the enslaved workers. The official guidebooks distributed to visitors described the house's architectural pedigree, Georgian style, Palladian influences, classical proportions, but not the labor system that made construction possible. This wasn't accidental omission. It was deliberate historical reconstruction. The early 20th century marked the peak of lost cause mythology, when the South rewrote Civil War history to minimize slavery's centrality and romanticize the Confederacy. This revisionism extended to the White House. Acknowledging enslaved builders would complicate the patriotic narrative. Presidents of this era enforced racial segregation in government offices. Woodrow Wilson segregated federal agencies in 1913, reversing decades of integrated government employment. The White House staff remained integrated, but black employees were restricted to service positions: butlers, maids, cooks. They couldn't advance to administrative roles. The house that enslaved workers built now employed their descendants in positions that reinforced racial hierarchy. The historical silence had practical effects. When the White House Historical Association formed in 1961 to preserve and interpret the mansion's history, early publications barely mentioned enslaved labor. The narrative focused on presidents, architecture, and diplomatic events. The workers were footnotes at best, invisible at worst. Archaeological evidence was ignored or dismissed. When renovations uncovered artifacts from the construction period, they were often discarded without documentation. Fragments that could have revealed details about workers' lives, broken tools, personal items, construction debris, were treated as trash rather than historical evidence. The 1948-1952 Truman renovation provides a case study in missed opportunity. The project completely gutted the house, removing everything down to the exterior walls. Workers discovered construction details, original materials, and evidence of early occupancy. This should have prompted historical investigation into who built what they were demolishing. Instead, the focus remained on structural engineering and architectural preservation. The human story was secondary. Harry Truman, who ordered the renovation, was genuinely interested in White House history. He read extensively about previous presidents and collected historical documents. But even his curiosity didn't extend to the enslaved workers. The questions weren't asked because the culture didn't value those answers. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s began changing this silence. Black historians and activists started demanding honest accounting of American history. They pointed out the ironic that the White House, symbol of American democracy, was built by enslaved labor. This created discomfort and resistance. Some defenders argued that enslaved labor was normal for the time and shouldn't be judged by modern standards. Others claimed that emphasizing slavery's role was divisive and unpatriotic. These arguments revealed the deeper problem. Acknowledging moral failure threatened national mythology. The White House continued to employ predominantly black service staff through the 20th century. Many were descendants of enslaved workers who'd served at the mansion a century earlier. They carried family oral histories, stories passed down about ancestors who'd worked in the house. But these stories weren't included in official histories. Eugene Allen, a White House butler from 1952 to 1986, served 8 presidents. His father had been enslaved in Virginia. Eugene himself grew up under Jim Crow segregation in Virginia, then spent 34 years serving in the house his ancestors' labor had built. His story, dramatized in the film The Butler, illustrates the continuity of service across generations and the continuity of historical erasure. The National Park Service assumed responsibility for White House historical interpretation in the 1960s. This brought professional historical standards, but didn't immediately change the narrative. Early NPS publications continued the pattern of minimizing enslaved labor's role. Change came slowly, driven by pressure from scholars and activists. The 1990s marked a turning point. Historian William Seal published The President's House, a comprehensive 2-volume history that acknowledged enslaved workers prominently. The White House Historical Association began updating its materials to include more complete history. But resistance remained strong. Some visitors complained that discussing slavery at the White House was political or inappropriate. Tour guides who mentioned enslaved workers sometimes faced criticism for making tourists uncomfortable. The expectation was that White House tours should celebrate American achievement, not confront American failure. This attitude revealed the stakes of historical truth-telling. Acknowledging enslaved labor meant acknowledging that American democracy was built on profound moral compromise. It meant recognizing that the symbols of freedom were created by people who had none. It meant sitting with discomfort that many visitors preferred to avoid. The physical house was meticulously preserved, paint colors researched, furniture authenticated, architectural details documented. But the human history remained incomplete. We know what James Hoban ate for breakfast based on his account books. We don't know the names of most enslaved workers who built the house. The disparity illustrates whose stories mattered. By the end of the 20th century, the White House had undergone multiple renovations, hosted 42 presidents, and welcomed millions of visitors. It had become one of the most photographed buildings in the world, instantly recognizable, symbolically powerful. But the foundational truth about its construction remained obscured, minimized, and uncomfortable. The house was white, painted to cover burn scars from the War of 1812. But the whitewashing of history went deeper than paint. It was cultural, systematic, and deliberate. The next chapter would require confronting what had been buried for 2 centuries. Chapter 8. Unearthing the Truth. The reckoning began not with a grand gesture, but with documents in an archive. In the early 2000s, historians started systematically combing through the records of the commissioners who oversaw the White House construction. What they found was damning in its banality. Line after line of Negro hire payments, casual mentions of enslaved workers, accounting that treated human beings as equipment rentals. The White House Historical Association launched a comprehensive research project in 2000 to document enslaved workers' contributions. Researchers examined construction, records, payment ledgers, contemporary newspapers, and slaveholder estate papers. They cross-referenced sources, tracked down descendants, and slowly began assembling names and stories. The findings confirmed what activists had long claimed. Enslaved workers were central to construction, not peripheral. They weren't helping skilled white craftsmen. They were the skilled craftsmen. The number of enslaved workers exceeded previous estimates. The duration of their involvement spanned the entire construction period. Michelle Obama, First Lady from 2009 to 2017, brought unprecedented attention to this history. In a 2016 speech at the Democratic National Convention, she said, "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves." The statement was simple, factual, and powerful. It generated immediate controversy. Critics accused her of exaggerating slavery's role or being divisive. Fact-checkers rushed to verify her claim. As if enslaved labor at the White House was contested history rather than documented fact. The controversy itself revealed how successful the historical erasure had been. A straightforward truth about the house's construction had become controversial because generations of Americans had never been told. The White House responded by making enslaved workers' contributions more prominent in tours and educational materials. The visitor center began featuring exhibits about construction labor. The website added historical information. These changes were modest but significant. Official acknowledgement after 2 centuries of silence. Archaeological investigations added physical evidence to documentary records. A 2000 excavation on the grounds uncovered artifacts from the construction period, broken tools, pottery fragments, buttons, and clay pipe stems. These mundane objects connected directly to workers' lives. The clay pipes, for instance, were identical to those found at slave quarters throughout the South, strong evidence of enslaved workers' presence. Further excavations discovered the remains of a privy, an outdoor toilet from the early 19th century. Its location and contents suggested it served workers rather than the presidential family. Analysis of the soil revealed dietary patterns consistent with slave quarters: cornmeal, cheap cuts of pork, limited variety. The ground itself testified to inequality. The most significant archaeological finding came in 2010. Evidence of a temporary structure that likely housed workers during construction. The building's footprint, recovered through soil analysis and artifact distribution, showed cramped quarters with minimal amenities. Workers who crafted elegant interiors for the mansion lived in rough barracks barely adequate for shelter. These discoveries prompted broader questions about White House grounds. How many structures once existed but were erased? Where exactly did enslaved staff live in the 19th century? What happened to their possessions, their graves, their material culture? Some evidence will never be recovered. The 1902 renovation removed and discarded enormous amounts of original material. The 1948 to 1952 Truman renovation eliminated more. Each modernization erased physical traces of the people who built and maintained the house. The loss is permanent. But oral histories survived. Descendants of enslaved White House workers began sharing family stories publicly. These accounts provided details absent from official records: personal names, family relationships, daily experiences, moments of resistance. One descendant, Zaneal Logan, traced her ancestry to Jeremiah Gostick, an enslaved carpenter who worked on the White House construction. Logan's research revealed that Gostick was skilled in fine woodwork and likely contributed to the mansion's interior details. After construction, Gostick was sold away from his family, common practice that destroyed enslaved families routinely. Another descendant shared stories about an ancestor who escaped from White House service in the 1830s. The escape succeeded, and the man reached Philadelphia, where he lived free under an assumed name. His story survived through family oral tradition, while official records listed him only as absconded property. These personal histories complicate and enrich the official narrative. They reveal enslaved workers not as abstract labor units, but as individuals with families, skills, ambitions, and agency. They show resistance alongside oppression, survival alongside suffering, humanity alongside dehumanization. The National Archives began digitizing and making accessible the historical documents related to White House construction. This transparency allows independent researchers to verify claims and discover new information. The digitization project is ongoing, but already it has revealed hundreds of previously overlooked references to enslaved workers. Academic historians published new scholarship integrating enslaved labor into White House history. Books, articles, and dissertations examined the construction, the workers, and the culture of erasure. This scholarship provided intellectual foundation for changing public understanding. Museums began addressing the topic. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened in 2016, features exhibits on enslaved labor in Washington, D.C., including at the White House. The exhibits use artifacts, documents, and personal stories to make the history tangible. Educational curricula changed as well. Textbooks that once mentioned enslaved labor only briefly now include substantial sections. Students learn the builders' names, those we know, and understand the construction as a collaboration between enslaved and free labor, though an involuntary and unjust collaboration. The White House itself installed a plaque in 2016 acknowledging enslaved workers' contributions. The plaque text reads, "This tribute is dedicated to the workers both free and enslaved, whose labor helped build and sustain the White House." It's placed in the White House Visitor Center, where tourists begin their tours. The plaque represents progress, but also illustrates the incompleteness of the reckoning. Free and enslaved creates false equivalence. Free workers chose their labor and received compensation. Enslaved workers had neither choice nor compensation. The phrase "helped build" minimizes their central role. The passive voice, "whose labor helped," avoids naming who enslaved them, who profited, and who perpetuated the system. Language matters because it shapes understanding. Precise language about slavery requires acknowledging its brutality, its centrality to American development, and the moral failure it represented. Euphemistic language, workers, labor, contributions, softens hard truths. The truth-telling project continues. New research emerges regularly. Descendants continue discovering and sharing family histories. The White House continues updating its educational materials. But the process reveals how difficult historical reckoning is. Even when facts are undisputed, their meaning and significance remain contested. The House stands, the archives open, the ground yields its secrets, and slowly, 2 centuries after construction, the full story approaches the light. Chapter 9. Living with Ghosts. What does it mean to live in a house built by enslaved people? This isn't an abstract question. 46 presidents have inhabited the White House. Barack Obama, the first Black president, confronted this question with particular intensity. Obama took office in January 2009. His election represented a profound historical shift. The descendant of enslaved people occupying a house built by enslaved people. The symbolism was obvious and inescapable. But the reality was more complex than symbolism. The Obama family brought unprecedented awareness to the White House's history of enslavement. Michelle Obama spoke openly about the irony and significance of raising her daughters in a house that enslaved people built. She framed it not as grievance but as progress, evidence of how far America had traveled from its original sin. But progress doesn't erase history. The Obama family lived among ghosts. Every room they occupied had been maintained by enslaved staff in earlier eras. The kitchen where their meals were prepared stood on foundations laid by enslaved workers. The very ground their daughters played on had been cleared by enslaved labor. The White House staff during the Obama years included descendants of enslaved workers who'd served at the mansion generations earlier. These connections weren't hypothetical. They were personal, familial, and immediate. The continuity of service across 2 centuries, from slavery through freedom to the present, illustrated both American progress and the persistence of inequality. The house itself contains physical traces of its enslaved builders, if you know where to look. The sandstone blocks of the original walls bear marks from the tools that shaped them: chisel marks, saw marks, the physical evidence of human labor. These marks are typically painted over, invisible to visitors, but they exist beneath the surface. The ground floor, where enslaved staff once worked, now houses the White House Library, the Vermeil Room, and other public spaces. The transformation from service area to public display represents architectural social climbing. But the spaces remember their origins. The ceiling heights remain lower. The windows remain smaller. The architecture still encodes hierarchy. Tour guides now routinely mention enslaved labor during White House tours. This represents significant change. Earlier generations of guides avoided the topic or mentioned it only if asked. But even current tours struggle with how much detail to include. How long should guides spend discussing enslaved workers in a 90-minute tour covering 200-plus years of history? The question reveals the challenge of integrating hard truths into celebratory narratives. The White House tour is designed to inspire pride in American democracy, showcase historical artifacts, and create positive visitor experiences. Dwelling on slavery seems to contradict these goals, But ignoring slavery creates false history. Some visitors resist hearing about enslaved labor. They've come to see where presidents lived, not to confront uncomfortable truths about American history. Their resistance isn't necessarily malicious. It reflects cultural conditioning that treats slavery as peripheral to American history rather than central to it. Other visitors specifically seek information about enslaved workers. They ask questions tour guides can't fully answer because the historical record is incomplete. How many enslaved workers total? What were their names? What happened to them after construction? These reasonable questions often lack definitive answers. The White House grounds contain no memorial specifically dedicated to enslaved workers who built the house. Various proposals have been made over the years: a statue, a garden, a dedicated museum space. But none have been implemented. The absence speaks volumes about priorities and discomfort. Compare this to how the White House memorializes other aspects of its history. Plaques throughout the building identify where significant events occurred. The Rose Garden is meticulously maintained and historically documented. Presidential portraits line the walls. Every president's legacy is carefully curated and preserved. But the workers who made the house possible remain largely uncommemorated. The contrast extends beyond the White House to Washington, D.C., generally. The National Mall features monuments to presidents, wars, and democratic ideals. Only recently has the city begun memorializing slavery and its victims. The National Museum of African American History and Culture opened in 2016, over 2 centuries after the White House was built. Living with this history requires acknowledging its ongoing impact. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans traces directly to slavery and its aftermath. The residential segregation of Washington, D.C. reflects decades of discriminatory housing policy. The underrepresentation of Black Americans in positions of power, including the presidency, connects to a history that began with enslaved people building the very seat of power. The White House embodies American contradiction, a democratic symbol built through tyranny, a testament to freedom created by forced labor, a beacon of equality constructed through the most profound inequality. This isn't past history, it's present reality. Every president who lives in the White House inherits this legacy. They can acknowledge it or ignore it, confront it or avoid it, but they cannot escape it. The House demands a reckoning that America has never fully undertaken. What would adequate reckoning look like? Perhaps a comprehensive memorial on the White House grounds, featuring the names of every documented enslaved worker. Perhaps substantial educational programming for the millions of annual visitors. Perhaps financial support for descendants of enslaved White House workers, acknowledging the unpaid labor that built the house. Perhaps most importantly, reckoning requires truth-telling without euphemism. Not workers, but enslaved people. Not helped build, but built. Not unfortunate aspect, but moral catastrophe. Language that names reality rather than obscuring it. The ghosts of enslaved workers haunt the White House, not because they're restless spirits, but because their story remains incomplete. They haunt because we've tried to forget them. They haunt because justice delayed for 2 centuries approaches justice denied. The house stands, beautiful and powerful, a symbol recognized worldwide. But symbols derive meaning from truth. A symbol built on suppressed history is a lie dressed in white paint. America deserves better. The enslaved workers who built the White House deserve better. Truth deserves better. Chapter 10. The House We Built Together. Stand at the North Lawn fence today. Look past the tourists with cameras, past the Secret Service agents, past the perfectly maintained gardens. Look at the building itself. The white sandstone, the classical columns, the windows reflecting sky. This house was built by people whose names most Americans don't know. It was raised by hands that received no compensation. It was crafted by skills developed through experience but denied recognition. It stands as both achievement and indictment. We've traced this history from muddy construction site to global symbol. We've excavated the hidden stories, the suppressed truths, the uncomfortable realities. We've seen how generations of Americans chose amnesia over acknowledgement, celebration over reckoning, mythology over truth. But truth persists. The documents survive in archives. The artifacts emerge from the ground. The descendants carry forward the stories. And slowly, painfully, America begins to confront what it long denied. This house of democracy was built by enslaved people. This isn't merely historical curiosity. It's essential to understanding America. The White House embodies our national paradox, the gap between our stated ideals and our actual practices, between what we claim to value and what we actually do. That gap persists today in different forms: mass incarceration, educational inequality, the racial wealth gap, environmental injustice. The enslaved workers who built the White House didn't create these modern problems, but their story illuminates the historical roots. They show us how inequality becomes embedded in physical structures, encoded in architecture, woven into institutions. They show us how power depends on erasing those who build and maintain it. What now? The historical research will continue. More names will be recovered. More stories will emerge. The archaeological record will yield more artifacts. But research alone isn't enough. We need memorial, permanent, prominent, impossible to ignore. We need education that doesn't shy from hard truths. We need acknowledgement that doesn't resort to euphemism. We need reckoning that leads to action. The White House belongs to all Americans. It was built by all Americans, free and enslaved, black and white, immigrant and native-born. Its beauty was created through exploitation. Its symbolism rests on suppressed history. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish America. It enriches our understanding and honors those whose labor made the nation possible. Every visitor to the White House should know this story. Every student studying American history should learn these names. Every president who occupies the mansion should acknowledge the debt. The house stands. The story continues. The reckoning, long delayed, has finally begun. If this documentary has revealed truths you didn't know, share it. If these stories moved you, remember them. If this history matters, demand more truth-telling, more memorials, more acknowledgement. The White House was built by enslaved people. That's not a controversial claim. That's documented fact. What we do with that fact, how we remember, how we honor, how we reckon, that's up to us. The house was built in silence. Let's refuse to keep that silence.